Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcast. We hope you've been enjoying the series of audio and video that we've been putting out following the Independence Forum for Scotland conference. This week's podcast is another of those.
Stuart McHardy and Roger Emmerson, and the topic that they had the discussion on was "Wha's Like Us? A look at Scottishness, Scotland and independence."
And it was a really interesting discussion, wasn't it? And actually quite positive. Stuart McHardy in particular said he thought he saw signs that our culture was in pretty good shape and getting better. So we enjoyed it. Hope you do too.
It's only in 2009 that Scottish history became part of the curriculum of Scottish schools. 2009. Used to tell us that people from all over Europe, and basically the answer to that was, what? It's ridiculous. But we weren't deemed worthy of finding out who we were ourselves until 2009. And that in itself, there was a fight. That fight had been going on since the early 90s. I've not got time to go into it just now, but there was some real dirty work at the crossroads being done by the institutions that were supposedly in charge of Scottish education to make sure that we didn't teach our children about our history and our languages. It was verboten. Absolutely. And once you break the ice, things change. And I want to say something here that has been brought to my attention, and we've been talking about this on the way up as well. There's a habit that people have got, particularly people who get involved in activism of any kind. There's a habit to fall back on fighting old fights because, like everybody else here, because I'm concerned with the political situation, I've got a bit of a travelling vision. I don't see what's going on around me. And there was something happened this week that to me was an illustration of the fact that not only is the importance of culture being understood, but it's working. On Tuesday night there was the launch of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and believe it or not, I've got another book coming out. I can't stop. And so I was there. And I've been to an awful lot of these do's over the years. In fact, I went to so many, I stopped going. Because virtually every cultural event that you attended in Scotland would tend to be, the speaker would be, if not actually English, one of those jocks that tried to sound like it. And here, the lassie that was up there was speaking in a gay Scots voice, and a tongue publisher was there and he said, "What is that lass?" And it was Liz Niven, who I had last met when she was still at school because I worked with her mother on Scots language politics back in the 90s. And that in itself was quite startling. It wasn't an English voice of any kind that was speaking about the Edinburgh International Book Festival. It was a Scotswoman. And then they had a poet on. And the poet was, and if you didn't know this lass, look it up. Her name's Len Penny. And she's in her 20s. And she is absolutely bloody brilliant. And she did two poems. One was in English, and the other one was in Scots. At the launch of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Things are moving. Things are moving. And I was told a few years back by a young architect, said, stop fighting the old fights, you've won a lot of them. And we forget, because we're so used to fighting the good fight. We think we've got to keep on going on about things, but a lot of things are moving, and that's because the cultural aspect of things has shifted. And I would like to, at this point, bring in, seeing Roger mentioned music, and we're not going to sing, honestly. I had a sigh of relief there. I thought somebody would say, oh, no, that's a shame, but there you go. That's what you think. But there are things that happen, things that change, things that move, and we have been exposed to a lot of these things over the years where we've seen things change. And the idea that all the fights that we've had in the past still remain to be won aren't true. We have to be aware of the fact that our culture has survived. And one of the things, I'm going to give you one example and I'm going to pass over to Roger again. back in the day, I wasn't a fan of the Corries, right? I didn't particularly, well, I didn't get on with them. I kind of knew them. I got on with Roy, but I didn't get on with the others. And I thought I cared about my own culture, I thought I cared about my own history. And I was a bit taken aback with the idea that they kept singing all these Jacobite songs. Thank God they did. Because what they were reflecting was a part of Scottish history that, although it's been ignored by everyone that's ever been paid as a historian in this country, has never left the consciousness of the common folk of Scotland. The reason that we kept singing Jacobite songs was that the folk can't find what had happened. There's like a folk memory of what happened after Culloden in the 10 years afterwards. That's why the songs retained the power. That's why they retained the capacity to stir folk, because it hadn't been forgotten in the culture. And I've been involved with quite a bit of recent revivalism with Jacobite songs, because it matters that we remember. And I don't know how many of you have seen it, but we've got a programme up on Scottish television about the occupation of Scotland after Culloden. And that links directly into this, because the research behind that, which is mine, came about through stories. And it came about that we found a document that told us about the British Army being here for 10 years after Culloden. And the only way that got out into the public was because a bunch of my students helped me transcribe that, and then one of them put it up on the web. Every institution to do with Scottish history that I approached told me the same thing when I said, can I get help to get this information out? Oh, I'm sorry, we've not got a budget for that. Every professor, and I'm not going to name them, that I approached said, oh, well, no, I'm not sure, or promised to do something and did nothing. So what eventually happened was that a bunch of ordinary people caring about their own culture, part of their own culture, got together and did something. And it's down to us to keep doing things, because the institutions we've inherited are no bloody good at all.
I think a follow-up from that is that certainly what interested me when I saw the general description of this convention, which was about, I was told, was it like to be a Scot today? And what I did, the first thought that came across my mind was, well, it was to be confident. And I felt, for a long time, very confident. And one of the things that struck me, again, that within the narrow context of my own profession and the things that people do, in 1999, Miles Glendinning, Scottish architectural historian, and David Page, very well-known, well-respected Scottish architect, chose to write a book about Scottish architecture. The intention was that they would interview Scottish architects about working in Scotland, being Scottish, and what it would mean. The first paragraph in the book confesses that they were unable to do this. They couldn't get anybody to talk. And so the books were slightly one way to talk about city planning and not about what they intended. When I was researching Land of Stone, I thought, well, I've got to go and speak to some architects here. I can't just be shooting my mouth off. It's just my ideas. And what was fascinating to me was people were queuing up to talk. Now, they might not have been very specific about things that we would find interesting, such as how do you get to become independent, and how precise are you, or do you really know what it is that is Scottish about your architecture. They found that difficult, but they certainly had a very positive sense of being Scottish and that working in Scotland was relevant. And the profoundly significant aspect of that, when asked, was that the Parliament had changed things for them, both as a building and as an institution. Now, it changed things, not, as I say, in any sense compelling some of them to be vocal about independence, they're very cautious architects because they're terrified their clients will walk if they show any sign of political affiliation, which other than basically mainstream. But there is a sense that I got, and certainly in the interviews, was interesting. What's followed from that is I'm now being invited to speak to architectural practices about something which I thought was very narrow, which was how do you become an architect, how do you practice architecture in Scotland, what is it do you think you're doing, what is it about Scottish architecture that is Scottish? And that's a tricky one because we can get into a discussion which is aesthetic, and that's a difficult area because everybody knows what they like, even if they don't know anything about the subject. But I think there are more profound reasons why you would consider yourself to be Scottish and working within a Scottish culture, and I think that is a more philosophical point of view, a more philosophical position to be in. And that is principally what the book Land of Stone tries to describe. And I'll give you a couple of bits from it just now, what actually impelled this. One of the things that's always struck me about Scottish culture historically and prehistorically even is the sense of being between things. The willow is significant in Pictish and Celtic culture simply because it stands between the land and the water. The rowan is of significance for the same reason because it stands between the earth and the sky, between folk and the gods. So that I've always been fascinated by this duality that sits within Scottish culture, and I began to look at buildings from that point of view. But there were other areas where the duality was fascinating. We've all said, I'm in 12 minds, all of us. But we're not saying that because we're going to make a decision. We're not going to come down one side or the other. What we're going to do is deal with the two issues that are in front of us simultaneously. It's what we do, it's why we're invented. It's why we are probably the most invented nation that has ever existed outside India. And I think you keep coming across these dualities. We are the only country in the world where you can wander with intent. You can stray. And these struck me as absolutely fundamental ideas, and they kept cropping up. I then, you'll hate me for this, but I then began to look at Immanuel Kant and his concept of antinomy, which is thesis and antithesis. Again, two ideas, but he's not saying you make a decision about one or the other, you occupy both ideas and the space in between. Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, has parallax, which is exactly the same idea. And even our own Archibald Allison had the well-known Caledonian Antisyzygy, which everybody misinterprets, but is exactly the same thing. It's two ideas that you can contain at the same time. So, I mean, if I take an example, people from Edinburgh will know the buildings of James Gowans. And they're designed in a very technical way, in a manner to achieve a stone construction which is simple, but they come across as romantic. They're conceived rationally, but they present romantically. So they're not one, they're not the other. And the more I looked at buildings in Scotland, and I refer to many of them in the book, Scotland in 100 Buildings, there is this duality present. It doesn't resolve itself, it doesn't become one, it doesn't become the other, and it doesn't compromise. But what it does do is has this reciprocal effect between the two ideas. The more I progressed with that, the more I thought that's where we are. And the fact that there are descriptors in common parlance, I'm in 12 minds. I hear my dudes, gee whiz. these are great concepts. These are things people can work with, and I just see this more and more. And that's what gives me a lot of confidence that we can talk about these things and we don't have to feel somehow that this is a bit folksy, a bit down home, a bit goody. It's to the point. It's absolutely to the point.
Two questions, one architectural, one historical for me. The architectural comes because I'm a former president of the EIS, World's Oldest Teachers' Trade Union, and it's about the impact of PFI on spaces to think. No staff rooms, so therefore teachers are constrained to be able to think. Which goes back to the point about, your point about the historical, about not teaching Scottish history. Now, I started teaching history and modern studies in 1982, having done a degree in history and politics. And the point about Scottish history is in some ways well made, but in others not quite the case. There's two things. Firstly, the positive. The impact of Braveheart on history departments in Scotland was transformational, without a shadow of a doubt transformational. And my history officer number said, until recently, Bill, Scottish history we can't touch, you might get a little bit of it in the second year, and he said, now with Braveheart, they cannot not teach Scottish history. So the impact of Braveheart is absolutely groundbreaking. But on the other hand, to expect curricular change, you're right about the higher echelon resistance, but to allow that to happen in schools, to change it, requires time, space and resource for teachers to do that, and therefore they feel under threat, would like to do that, but where to get the time, okay? And in that sense, I think that's very important. And we don't talk enough about the impact of Walter Scott in culture. God bless him for Scottish tourism. I think there's an interesting tension between folk memory and possibly, the romantic perverse of Scott and the 45.
Well, that's right. No, you brought up an absolutely fabulous point there, because Walter Scott is a contentious figure. And I, for many, many years, agreed, drawn attention to the underlying problems that Scotland faces as being made explicit in the architecture of Edinburgh. Because on Princes Street, you've got this gigantic spaceship devoted to the memory of a lawyer for the Borders. And tucked away at the side of Carlton Hill, you've got a beautiful Greek, but rather modest monument to the greatest poet the world's ever seen, Robert Burns, and I hope there'll be no bloody argument about that for anybody. And that actually sums up the problem in quite a way, that the Walter Scott is acceptable to the institutionalised view of what Scotland is within the Empire. Burns is not. Burns, they try and co-opt wherever they can, but he's not acceptable because he was a man of the people, he was a reader of Thomas Paine, he was probably a Jacobite, and the simplest way I can put that is I'm the sole member of the Jacobite Republican Party. Nobody else wants to join. I am both a Jacobite and Republican, for the simple reason that the Jacobite cause was fundamentally Scottish. And if you doubt that, go look at the blades that were manufactured for the 1715 rebellion, because on them they've all got the same motto. Prosperity to Shortland were made in the Netherlands, and no union. That's key to understanding this. And Walter Scott is key to understanding this, because Walter Scott was the most... Has anybody been to Abbotsford, by the way? Does that no put the chills up the back of your neck? The one man was severely conflicted. He was. Because what he did was...
English architect, by the way. English architect.
Oh, well, that explains it. That explains it. I'll pass over to you a minute, because you want to talk about Scott too. Can I finish one thing?
Of course, go ahead.
Scott was an absolute member for the establishment. He was a very, very strong supporter of the militia. He couldn't join the militia because his polio as a child, he wasn't a good enough horseman. But James D. Young, and for those of you that didn't know James D. Young, Dignwood, finest Scottish historian to date. And he, when he died just over a decade ago, he was working on a project that he said he had research done that showed that Walter Scott was the Paymaster General for the spy network of the British government in Scotland. I believe that. I've been trying to get hold of his notes, I've no managed, but I believe it. Walter Scott was a complete and utter Brit, but he was at the same time drawn to his own past and his own heritage in a way that he could never forget. And in that sense, he's a perfect example of the two things. And I think it cost him grief for his life. But we can come to terms with it now.
You've got Scott, you've got Braveheart, we've got J.K. Rowling, who's now affected how people perceive Edinburgh. 30 years ago, the image of Edinburgh was the new town. Currently, the image of Edinburgh is Dean Court, Wellcourt and Dean Village. It's Victoria Street, and it's Royal Circus Lane. Those are the images that are returned to us. In addition to J.K. Rowling, we've got Outlander, which quite transformed people's view of Curtis. These, in a sense, all of them are what I would call, or what Zizek calls, having the foreign gaze. They try to take what we have and repackage it and return it to us. And it's the extent to which we feel that the repackaged cultural object is of relevance. You questioned Scott for a number of reasons. We can certainly question Braveheart, not the least for its accents. And we can certainly question Harry Potter and Outlander. But these are elements which are repackaged for our benefit. And I say it's the extent to which we deal with them. Going beyond that, in a way that any nation, its perception of itself and its culture is partially generated by those from with. That's how we know who we are, is because people tell us who they think we are. It's up to us then to adapt and adopt what we think is relevant in what their perception of us actually is and what their perception of our culture is. This is, of course, has been historically a problem for us because of the well-known cultural cringe, which was we didn't really have any particularly strong view about our culture, or if we did, we were embarrassed by it, or made to feel embarrassed by it. I don't see that now. The people I talk to, people who 20 or 30 years ago would certainly have been sort of fairly disparaging about it, have come to accept the fact that there is a thing that is called Scottish culture, and it has very specific attributes, and it is in part because of the efforts of those who have given us the foreign gaze, which has allowed us to reflect on what it is that we're doing. So I think that while we can criticise them for certain things, I think we have to understand they and whoever succeeds them in the years and decades to come will actually be of significance to us in our culture, because it allows us to take our place in the world at large, to understand where we are and what respect or disrespect others may have of what we're doing. Our problem perhaps is that for too long we've understood that we have been disrespected rather than respected. But I think we take our hats off to these various individuals and say they had some respect for what it is that we're doing, and we should applaud them for that.
Could I just say that there's not much evidence that the BBC understands Scottish culture, and you know, there are a huge number of folk around who have found their way to Scotland and who have very little idea about Scotland, about Scottish history, Scottish culture, Scots or Gaelic or whatever language, and we've got somehow or other, if we're going to re-win our independence, we've got to get some of these folk on board. And you know, I take your optimism. I'm a natural pessimist on most things, but how do you get out with the bubble, out with this room, out with the cultural sort of group in Scotland? You know, okay, the singers, the actors, perhaps even the authors are getting more pro-Scottish and recognising Scottish culture, but there's a huge population out there who don't really mix with these folk.
Okay, that's a fair enough point. I'm going to come at slightly crabwise, because what Roger says about the external gaze is very, very interesting. I've been telling everybody about the thing that's up on YouTube by Jeremy Clarkson. Have any of you seen it? Right, very few of you. Well, go look it up. Jeremy Clarkson is on YouTube speaking to, I'm not sure who it is, because I've never been able to watch the whole thing without falling about laughing. He has behind him a screen, and on the screen he brings up the inventions that arose in Wales, quarter of a page. Then he has the inventions that came from Ireland, which is 3/4 of a page on the page. Then he has the inventions that come from England, and it's about a page. And then he says, and here's the inventions from Scotland, page after page after page after page, about a dozen pages. Now, we've been talking about this, and Roger reckons he's got somebody in mind that he's trying to approach with this, but this is someone who would not be understood as particularly sympathetic to what we perceive of ourselves to be. A couthy, intelligent, warm-hearted bunch of folk up here in Scotland. We would not think of Jeremy Clarkson as one of our numbers, but he cannot avoid the reality, or again, it's an aspect of what Roger says with the external gaze. People come and look at us. Think of how many of us have gone abroad. Now, I looked at something quite recently that showed the population figures from 1703 to 2020. In England, that's the line. In Scotland and Ireland, that's the line. This is what has happened with us being part of the empire. We have to realise that. We've not got to agree with it, we've got to realise it, and we've got to work on, and we've got to be positive. And there are things to be positive about. And I want to, because time's getting on, I want to talk about one last wee thing here. Because apart from anything else, we have to remind ourselves that part of our culture, and our culture is rooted in the common folk, and the notion in, south of the border, and particularly in the heartland of south of the border, London, is that culture is something that posh folk purchase. If you look at what the posh folk go and see, it's, Italian opera, a Russian ballet, and all this sort of stuff. The notion is that culture is something that rich folk do. You look at the cultural life of any European nation, and you will find that people there understand that their greatest creations arise from the common culture of their nation. Culture comes up the way. It does not go down the way, it never has. And one of the things that has been problematic for an awfully long time has been, and I have to say, a thank you, by the way, to Roger, because in his 100 buildings he included some beautiful prehistoric stuff, including the Broch, which, for those of you that do know about it, is the most perfectly designed building in history. But recently, something has happened in Scotland that is not properly appreciated here, because the London-centric viewpoint can't deal with the realities of it. And that is the Nesset Broadgard dig, which everyone's been aware of. And what they're saying there is that around about 3000 BC, the largest stone-built building on planet Earth was disassembled and replaced by a series of other smaller versions of the same thing. The largest stone-built building on the planet was here. Our culture goes back a long way, and the same as Abby's pedigree goes back to the dawn of time, to Mother Africa. We have got a depth to our culture that we have not been allowed to appreciate, we've not been allowed to see because of the stultified effects of the British Empire mentality, which still rules in London. It's absolutely dominant in London. The people that are pulling the strings down there, the ones that are telling that Dalek Starmer what to do, are people who are, in their heads, still members of the British Empire. But I want to leave you with thought, because one of the aspects of Scottish culture is that we are a Coothie lot, we're a communitarian lot, I would say. And because of that, we appreciate you, man. Okay? So I'm going to tell you something that you'll have to check out for yourselves. But for a long time, there has been an annual gathering down at Elsternford in East Lothian because of the battle that was fought there and supposedly gave rise to the Saltire. Most of you will know the story. Well, if you actually look at the rock art from Broadgard, there are hundreds and hundreds of crosses. They don't have straight lines at the side, they've got curved edges. And it may be that they're a reference to time. It's not that complicated an archaeological thing, but it's about alignments. But the actual basic shape of that is the saltire. So I'm going to claim that the saltire is 5,000 years old. And how should I know it? Because it's my culture, and I can do what I like with it. Because that's the point. We need the bar at our feet, and the bar we need at our feet is our bar, and not something we've been given from anybody else.
So I just really enjoyed that. I just enjoyed the discussion between the two of them. I mean, it was a real conversation, wasn't it? And yeah, as you said at the beginning, there's a positivity there. And actually, it's got me thinking, I must go on to our back catalogue, because there are lots of podcasts that we've done. Well, I say we, but actually it was you, that of Stuart McHardy. That's right, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And you will be able to find them on our website, which is scottishindiepod.scot. We'll put the link in the notes, and I think from memory we put them together in a playlist, so
yeah.
If we did, we'll put the link to that in the notes as well. Stuart is a prolific author, and we did take the chance at the conference to nobble him to see if we could get him to come on the podcast as a guest to talk about some of his books, because he's got some really interesting books on the go. So look out for that, hopefully in the next few months.
Yeah.
And if you're watching this, Stuart,
we'll be in touch. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.